The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the federal courthouse as people hurried up and down, clutching briefcases and coffee cups. Officer Barrett stood at his usual post, watching the morning crowd with the stern expression he perfected over his 15 years on the job. He took pride in what he called his sixth sense about people, though others might have called it something far less flattering. The morning rush was in full swing when a well-dressed black man in his mid-30s approached the security checkpoint. His suit was perfectly tailored, his leather briefcase clearly expensive, and his stride confident. But something in Barrett's expression changed the moment he spotted him. His eyes narrowed, and that familiar look of suspicion crossed his face, the same one that had caused numerous complaints over the years, though none had ever stuck. "Hold it right there," Barrett called out, his voice carrying across the lobby. Several heads turned to watch. The man stopped, his expression carefully neutral, though something flickered in his eyes, not surprise, but rather a weary recognition of what was about to unfold. "ID and purpose of visit," Barrett demanded, despite having let 3 other people walk through moments before without so much as a glance at their credentials. The man reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, well aware of how officers like Barrett might interpret any sudden movements. "Sir, I have a meeting this morning," he explained calmly, presenting his credentials. Barrett barely glanced at them before demanding additional identification. The man produced his driver's license, his movements measured and composed, like someone who had performed this dance many times before. "This says you're an attorney," Barrett said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe it. He held the ID up to the light, turning it this way and that, as if convinced it must be fake. Behind them, the line was growing longer, and people were starting to whisper. "That's correct," the man replied, his voice steady. "I have an important meeting this morning that I need to get to." He checked his watch, a subtle gesture that seemed to irritate Barrett even more. "Oh, an important meeting, huh?" Barrett's voice dripped with sarcasm. The man's calm demeanor seemed to fuel Barrett's suspicion rather than allay it. "And I suppose you're here to argue a case before the Supreme Court?" He laughed at his own joke, looking around as if expecting others to join in. Nobody did. A young security officer nearby shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to intervene but hesitating to challenge her superior. The man noticed this too, his eyes briefly meeting hers before returning to Barrett. "Sir," the man said, his tone professional but firm, "I've provided my credentials. Is there something specific you need to verify?" The question was posed perfectly, polite enough to avoid any accusation of disrespect, but direct enough to challenge Barrett's behavior. Barrett responded by insisting on a full bag search, emptying the expensive briefcase onto the security table. He picked through legal documents and files with exaggerated care, making a show of reading random pages as if searching for contraband between the lines. The man remained still, his face a mask of composure, but his eyes were alert and observant. He watched as Barrett deliberately disorganized his carefully arranged files, noting the officer's name tag, the time, and the faces of the witnesses around them. His fingers twitched slightly near his pocket, where his phone was already recording the entire interaction. What Barrett didn't notice, too caught up in his power play, was the subtle way other courthouse employees were reacting. The clerks at the information desk were exchanging knowing looks. A security guard was speaking quietly into his radio. And through the growing crowd, word was already spreading about what was unfolding in the lobby. The morning sun had climbed higher now, streaming through the courthouse's tall windows and illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage. In the harsh light, Barrett's actions seemed even more stark and obvious, while the man's dignity in the face of such treatment stood out in sharp relief. Little did Barrett know, but this Monday morning was about to become anything but ordinary, and his sixth sense was about to backfire in a way he never could have anticipated. After the humiliating bag search, things only got worse. Barrett stepped closer, using his height to tower over the well-dressed man. The morning crowd in the courthouse lobby had grown larger, with people pretending to check their phones while actually watching the scene unfold. "So, you say you're here for a meeting?" Barrett's voice carried that edge of mockery that made several onlookers wince. "Let me guess, meeting your public defender?" He chuckled at his own joke, but the sound died quickly in the tense air of the lobby. The well-dressed man took a slow, deep breath. His hand brushed against his phone in his pocket, making sure it was still recording. Years of experience had taught him the importance of documentation. "No," he replied simply, his voice carrying the weight of patience earned through countless similar encounters. A young courier, rushing through with a stack of files, slowed down to watch. The man noticed how the courier's eyes widened in recognition. Clearly a regular at the courthouse who knew exactly who he was. But before the courier could say anything, the man gave a subtle shake of his head. He wanted this to play out exactly as it needed to. "Well then," Barrett continued, crossing his arms, "enlighten us about this very important meeting of yours." His tone dripped with sarcasm, each word carefully chosen to provoke a reaction. But if he was hoping for an outburst, he would be disappointed. Instead, the man calmly pulled out his phone and started taking notes. "Officer Barrett," he said, reading the name tag deliberately, "could you please repeat what you just said? I want to make sure I quote you accurately." This seemed to throw Barrett off balance for a moment. His eyes narrowed, and a flash of uncertainty crossed his face. But rather than backing down, he doubled down. "Oh, now we're taking notes, are we? Planning to file another one of those complaints that never go anywhere?" Two other security officers stood nearby, shifting uncomfortably. One of them, a veteran officer with gray at his temples, seemed to be trying to catch Barrett's eye, silently urging him to back off. But Barrett was too focused on his target to notice. The well-dressed man continued making notes on his phone, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. "Just documenting our interaction, officer. Please continue. You were saying something about complaints." A courthouse clerk walked past, deliberately slow, and handed the man a small business card while pretending to pick up a dropped paper. The card had a name and extension number written on it. Likely someone in courthouse administration. The man slipped it into his pocket without missing a beat. Barrett's face reddened at being so calmly challenged. "Listen here," he started, his voice rising slightly. "I've been working security in this courthouse for 15 years. I know who belongs here and who doesn't." "Interesting perspective," the man replied, still typing on his phone. "And what exactly makes you think I don't belong here?" The question hung in the air like a trap ready to spring. By now, a small crowd had gathered at a safe distance. Among them were legal assistants, paralegals, and other courthouse regulars, all watching with a mix of disgust and anticipation. Several had their phones out, quietly documenting the scene. Barrett seemed to realize he was losing control of the situation. His next words came out in a rush, almost stumbling over each other. "If you're really here for business, then why don't you just say what it is? Why all the mystery?" The man finally looked up from his phone, meeting Barrett's eyes directly. "Officer Barrett, I'm sure you're familiar with federal procedure. You've had 15 years here, after all. So you know that asking about the nature of someone's business in open court is inappropriate. But please continue. This is all very educational." The word federal seemed to catch Barrett's attention, but like someone too far committed to a bad hand in poker, he couldn't bring himself to fold. Instead, he gestured toward the main courtroom doors. "Well then, by all means, let's see where you're really headed." As they moved toward the courtroom, the man caught fragments of whispered conversations from the crowd. "Is that really him? Should we call someone?" "Oh, Barrett has no idea." The heavy wooden doors of the main courtroom loomed ahead, and with each step, the man's composure seemed to grow stronger, while Barrett's confidence began to crack ever so slightly. The morning sun streaming through the courthouse windows cast their shadows on the polished floor, one straight and sure, the other increasingly uncertain. The main lobby of the courthouse had become unnaturally quiet, the usual morning bustle replaced by tense attention. Barrett had positioned himself squarely in front of the well-dressed man, his voice echoing off the marble walls as he continued his misguided crusade. "You know what?" Barrett announced loudly, clearly playing to his growing audience. "I think you're lost. Criminal court's in the building across the street." He pointed toward the window with an exaggerated gesture. "That's probably where you meant to go, right?" The well-dressed man adjusted his tie calmly, a simple action that somehow made Barrett's theatrical display seem even more inappropriate. "Officer Barrett," he replied, his voice measured but carrying across the lobby, "are you suggesting I'm in the wrong building because of how I look?" A group of law clerks near the information desk stopped pretending to work and openly stared. One of them was frantically typing on her phone, likely messaging someone upstairs about the unfolding situation. Barrett's face flushed darker, but he pressed on. "Look, I'm just trying to help you out here. This is a federal courthouse. We handle serious business here." He emphasized serious with air quotes, drawing a few gasps from the onlookers. "Serious business," the man repeated thoughtfully, as if considering the phrase. "And what, in your professional opinion, makes you think I'm not here for serious business?" An older attorney walking past with a stack of files nearly dropped them when he recognized the well-dressed man. His eyes widened, and he quickly changed direction, heading straight for the elevators, presumably to alert someone upstairs. Barrett, oblivious to these reactions, continued his performance. "Well, for starters, most people who come here know exactly where they're going. They don't just wander in wearing fancy suits, trying to look important." The well-dressed man raised an eyebrow. "So my suit is now evidence of suspicious behavior. Please continue. This is fascinating." His phone was still recording in his pocket, capturing every word. A young security officer who had been watching nervously finally stepped forward. Officer Barrett, maybe we should." "Stay out of this," Barrett snapped, cutting her off. "I've been doing this job since before you were out of high school. I know what I'm doing." The well-dressed man glanced at the young officer sympathetically. "It's all right," he assured her. "Sometimes these situations need to play out fully." There was something in his tone that made several observers exchange knowing looks. Barrett, growing increasingly frustrated by his target's composure, raised his voice even louder. "You know what? I bet you picked up that suit from some donation center, didn't you? Trying to pass yourself off as something you're not." The lobby fell completely silent. Even the usual sounds of shuffling papers and clicking heels had stopped. The man's calm expression never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes, not anger, but rather a kind of resigned determination. "Officer Barrett," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "would you like to specify exactly what you think I'm trying to pass myself off as?" The shock in his words was obvious to everyone except Barrett, who plowed ahead recklessly. "We both know exactly what I mean. People like you don't have cases in federal court unless they're—" He never finished that sentence. A loud ding from the elevator interrupted him, and the doors opened to reveal the chief of courthouse security, his face grim as he took in the scene. The well-dressed man checked his watch, an elegant timepiece that probably cost more than Barrett's monthly salary. "Well, this has been enlightening, but I have a rather important case to present." He turned toward the main courtroom, his movements unhurried and dignified. Barrett, still trying to maintain control of the situation, moved to block his path one final time. "Oh no, you don't. You're not going anywhere until I'm satisfied you belong here." The growing crowd held their breath. The chief of security was making his way through the lobby, but he wasn't rushing. Like everyone else who knew the truth, he seemed to understand that this moment needed to unfold naturally. The well-dressed man simply stood there, radiating a quiet confidence that made Barrett's bluster seem increasingly foolish. The morning sun streaming through the high windows caught his face, highlighting an expression that somehow mixed patience with just a hint of anticipation. The look of someone who knew that justice, while sometimes slow, was absolutely certain. The heavy doors of the main courtroom loomed ahead as Barrett followed the well-dressed man, determined not to let him out of sight. The officer's boots squeaked against the polished floor, echoing through the now hushed corridor. Behind them, a growing crowd of courthouse regulars followed at a respectful distance, like an audience anticipating the final act of a play. "This ought to be good," Barrett muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Let's see how far you get trying to walk into a federal courtroom like you own the place." His voice carried that particular tone of someone who thought they were about to prove a point. The well-dressed man paused at the courtroom doors, his hand resting lightly on the wooden surface. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth, not mocking, but knowing. "Officer Barrett, would you like to enter first? I insist." Barrett snorted, reaching past him to push open the door. "Oh, now you're being polite? Little late for that, isn't it?" He gestured dramatically toward the entrance. "After you. I wouldn't want to miss this." Inside, the courtroom was already filling up. Attorneys in crisp suits arranged papers at their tables. Court reporters set up their equipment with practiced efficiency. The morning sun filtered through the high windows, casting long rectangles of light across the deep wood panels and green marble walls. The well-dressed man walked confidently down the center aisle, his leather shoes making no sound on the carpeted floor. Barrett followed close behind, a smirk still plastered across his face. Several attorneys looked up as they passed, their expressions changing from curiosity to recognition to poorly concealed amusement. "Sir," a court clerk called out, half rising from her seat, but the well-dressed man gave her a subtle shake of his head. She sat back down, hiding a smile behind her hand. Barrett, noticing none of these reactions, continued his running commentary. "You know, this is a federal trafficking case today. Very high profile. They don't just let anyone walk in here." His voice, though quieter now in the formal setting, still carried that edge of superiority. The well-dressed man nodded thoughtfully. "A trafficking case, you say? How interesting." He continued walking toward the front of the courtroom, where two tables faced the judge's bench. The defense table was already occupied by a team of attorneys in expensive suits, but the prosecution's table stood empty, files and laptops neatly arranged, waiting. Barrett's stride got a bit longer, trying to get ahead. "Hey, you can't go up there. That's reserved for." He stopped mid-sentence as the well-dressed man smoothly slid into the space behind the prosecution's table, setting his briefcase down with practiced ease. A murmur rippled through the growing courtroom audience. Several people who had witnessed the scene in the lobby had filtered in, finding seats quickly, not wanting to miss what was coming next. "Officer Barrett," the well-dressed man said quietly, organizing his papers, "you seem very knowledgeable about this case. Will you be staying to watch the proceedings?" His tone was perfectly professional, but there was something in it that made several nearby attorneys turn to watch. Barrett stood frozen, his earlier confidence beginning to crack like thin ice. "You can't. That's the prosecutor's table." His voice had lost some of its bluster, uncertainty creeping in at the edges. Just then, the side door opened, and the judge's clerk appeared. "All rise," she called out, her voice ringing through the courtroom. Everyone stood, including the well-dressed man, who straightened his tie with calm precision. Barrett remained rooted to the spot, his face beginning to pale as realization slowly dawned. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung shut with a final sounding thud, trapping him in what was quickly becoming his worst professional nightmare. The morning sunlight had shifted, and now it fell directly on the prosecution's table, illuminating the well-dressed man's face as he stood tall and composed, ready for what was about to unfold. In that moment, Even Barrett couldn't miss the absolute belonging in his stance, the natural authority in his presence. The question wasn't whether this man belonged in the federal courthouse. The question was how Barrett had ever convinced himself otherwise. The judge entered the courtroom with measured steps, his black robe flowing behind him. The room remained standing, the silence heavy with anticipation. Officer Barrett had retreated to the back wall, but his eyes never left the well-dressed man at the prosecutor's table. "Be seated," the judge announced, settling into his chair. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at his papers. "I understand we're here for the United States versus Richardson trafficking case." His voice carried the weight of decades on the bench. The defense team shuffled their papers. The well-dressed man stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced motion. The morning light from the high windows cast his shadow long across the courtroom floor as he cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and commanding. "The United States is ready to proceed." He paused for a moment, letting his next words fill the courtroom. "I am the lead federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice, and I will be presenting the government's case." The sound that escaped from Barrett's throat was barely audible, but in the quiet courtroom, it might as well have been a shout. Several heads turned to look at him, some with pity, others with poorly concealed satisfaction. The prosecutor continued, his voice steady and professional. "The United States has prepared extensive evidence demonstrating the defendant's involvement in a multi-state trafficking operation." He began laying out the government's case with the confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. Barrett's face had turned an impossible shade of pale. He looked like he wanted to melt into the wooden panels behind him. The young security officer from earlier slipped into the courtroom and tugged at his sleeve, probably trying to get him to leave, but he seemed frozen in place. The prosecutor laid out document after document, his arguments precise and devastating. Each time he referenced a federal statute or previous case law, his expertise became more evident. The defense attorneys, all expensive suits and leather briefcases, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. From the back of the courtroom, Barrett watched as the man he had humiliated in the lobby transformed into something else entirely, a master of his craft, commanding the attention of everyone present. The same hands Barrett had watched rifling through a wallet for ID now gestured with authority, emphasizing key points of federal law. The judge nodded along, clearly familiar with the prosecutor's work. "Proceed with your opening statement," he said, and the prosecutor stepped out from behind his table. As he moved to address the jury, he passed close to where Barrett stood. Their eyes met for just a moment. There was no anger in the prosecutor's gaze, no satisfaction at Barrett's discomfort. Only a calm professionalism that somehow made the situation even more devastating. The chief of courthouse security had slipped into the back of the courtroom. He stood near Barrett, his arms crossed, watching the proceedings with a grim expression. Barrett could feel his supervisor's presence like a weight on his shoulders. The prosecutor's voice filled the courtroom as he began his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about justice. It's about looking beyond surfaces and seeing the truth that lies beneath." His words carried a double meaning that wasn't lost on anyone who had witnessed the earlier confrontation. Every eye in the jury box was fixed on him. Even the defense attorneys watched with reluctant admiration as he commanded the space. The morning sun had climbed higher now, and as it streamed through the windows, it illuminated the federal prosecutor's face, highlighting the quiet dignity that Barrett had so completely failed to recognize. In the back of the courtroom, Barrett finally accepted the young officer's urgent tugging at his sleeve. As he turned to leave, he caught fragments of whispered conversations around him. Can you believe he tried to stop the federal prosecutor? Did you see his face when he realized? I heard he even suggested he was in the wrong building. The heavy doors closed behind Barrett with a soft thud, but even in the corridor, he could still hear the prosecutor's voice, clear, authoritative, and belonging exactly where he was. The first recess came just before noon. As people filed out of the courtroom, The federal prosecutor remained at his table, organizing his notes with methodical precision. The morning's opening arguments had been devastating for the defense, but his mind was already on a different matter entirely. The chief of courthouse security stood waiting in the hallway, his face etched with concern. When the prosecutor emerged from the courtroom, the chief stepped forward. "Sir, I want to personally apologize for what happened this morning. Officer Barrett's behavior was completely unacceptable." The prosecutor held up a hand. "Let's discuss this in your office," he said quietly. Several people lingering in the hallway were clearly trying to overhear the conversation. The prosecutor's phone sat heavy in his pocket, still containing the recording of the morning's events. In the security office, with the door closed, the atmosphere was tense. The chief sat behind his desk, looking years older than he had that morning. "Sir, I want you to know that disciplinary action will be taken immediately. Officer Barrett's behavior goes against everything we stand for." The prosecutor took a seat, his movements unhurried. "I appreciate that," he said, placing his phone on the desk between them. "But I'm not here for Officer Barrett's job. I'm here to discuss something more important." He tapped his phone screen, and Barrett's voice filled the room, each discriminatory comment crystal clear in the recording. The chief's face grew grimmer with each passing second. When the recording finished, silence filled the office. "This is deeply troubling," he managed finally. "What's troubling?" The prosecutor replied, his voice level, "is that this isn't an isolated incident." He pulled out a small notebook and opened it. "In the past hour, 3 different courthouse employees have approached me with similar stories. The only difference is that they didn't have the authority to make themselves heard." The chief shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sunlight streamed through the office blinds, casting stretched shadows across his desk. "What are you suggesting?" The prosecutor leaned forward slightly. "I'm suggesting that we have an opportunity here, not for punishment, but for real change." He pulled out the business card the clerk had slipped him earlier. "Your own staff has been trying to address this. They just needed someone to listen." Outside the office, the usual bustle of courthouse activity continued. Inside, the 2 men discussed systematic changes, training programs, and accountability measures. The prosecutor's legal pad filled with notes, each point focused not on retribution, but on prevention. "This isn't about one officer," the prosecutor explained, his voice firm, but not unkind. "It's about making sure nobody who walks through those courthouse doors faces what I faced this morning. Every person who enters this building deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance." The chief nodded slowly, beginning to understand. This wasn't going to be a simple disciplinary action that would be forgotten in a few weeks. This was going to be a complete overhaul of how things were done. As they wrapped up their discussion, the prosecutor glanced at his watch. The afternoon session would begin soon. "I'll have my office draft a formal recommendation," he said, standing. "But I want your team involved in implementing these changes. The people who work here every day often have the best solutions." The chief stood as well, extending his hand. "Thank you for handling this the way you have. It would have been easy to demand firings or file complaints." The prosecutor shook his hand firmly. "Easy isn't always right, and right isn't always easy." He gathered his notes, tucking them into his briefcase. "Change happens when we choose to make moments like this matter." As he walked back toward the courtroom, he passed Officer Barrett's now empty post. The young security officer who had tried to intervene earlier stood there instead, standing a little straighter when she saw him. He gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, recognizing an ally in the changes to come. The afternoon sun had shifted, throwing different shadows across the courthouse lobby. But something else had shifted too. A small but significant change had begun, starting with one difficult morning and one choice to turn humiliation into hope for a better future. 3 months had passed since that memorable morning at the federal courthouse. The building looked the same from the outside. Same imposing columns, same broad steps leading to the entrance. But inside, things were different. The federal prosecutor walked up those familiar steps, noting the new faces at the security checkpoint. The changes weren't just about personnel, they were about culture. As he approached the entrance, he noticed a group of security officers in training gathered around an instructor who was explaining proper screening procedures. Remember, the instructor was saying, "Our job is to ensure safety while treating everyone with respect and dignity." She noticed the prosecutor walking past and gave him a small nod. She was the same young officer who had tried to intervene that day, now promoted to training coordinator for the new security protocols. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere had shifted. The security staff worked with professional efficiency, but there was something else too. A warmth in their interactions, a careful attention to treating everyone equally. The prosecutor noticed how they took extra care with elderly visitors, helped those who seemed confused, and maintained the same professional courtesy with everyone, regardless of appearance. At the security desk, a new sign caught his eye. "Our commitment to equal treatment and professional service." Below it was a QR code linking to the courthouse's updated policies and complaint procedures. The changes weren't perfect, but they were real and ongoing. As he made his way to his office, he passed the chief of security giving a tour to visitors from another courthouse. After implementing our new training program, the chief was explaining, "We've seen a complete turnaround in public feedback. Other federal buildings are starting to adopt our model." The prosecutor's phone buzzed with a message. It was from the courthouse administrator, confirming their afternoon meeting about expanding the training program to other courthouses in the district. What had started as one unfortunate incident had sparked a wave of positive change throughout the system. In his office, he found a letter waiting on his desk. It was from Officer Barrett. Not an angry complaint or a defensive justification, but a thoughtful reflection. The officer had gone through extensive retraining and counseling. He'd asked to share his story as part of the new training program, turning his mistake into a teaching moment for others. The morning sun streamed through his office window as he read the letter. Barrett wrote about confronting his own biases, about learning to see beyond his preconceptions, and about understanding that true security came from treating everyone with dignity. The words weren't perfect, but they were honest. A knock at his door interrupted his reading. It was one of the new security officers, asking for advice about a situation downstairs. The prosecutor listened carefully as the young officer explained his concern about potentially discriminatory behavior he'd witnessed from a visitor toward another security staff member. "You did the right thing by speaking up," the prosecutor assured him. "That's exactly what these new protocols are for." He watched the relief spread across the officer's face, seeing how the culture of accountability was taking root. Later that afternoon, he stood before a room full of courthouse staff, conducting another training session. The room was packed. Judges, clerks, security officers, and administrative staff all together. On the screen behind him, a simple message read, "Justice begins at the front door." What happened that morning wasn't just about one person or one incident, he told them. It was about recognizing that we all have a role in ensuring justice. True security isn't just about checking IDs and scanning bags. It's about creating an environment where every person is treated with the respect they deserve. As he looked out at the faces in the room, he saw understanding in their eyes. The story of what had happened that morning had become part of the courthouse's institutional memory, but not as a scandal or a source of shame. Instead, it had become a catalyst for positive change, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination isn't anger or revenge, but a steady, determined push towards something better. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. People came and went, each one treated with the same professional courtesy. It wasn't perfect. Change never is, but it was progress. Real, measurable progress, built one interaction at a time, one policy at a time, one person at a time. And that, the prosecutor knew, was how lasting change really happened.